An extremely important part of programming for athletes comes down to the actual training volume that you're working with. How many reps you're working with, how heavy should we be going, and how frequently should we be training with athletes. Obviously, the overall mindset here, we want to make sure that there's the lowest effective dosage in training, especially in areas that aren't that impactful for the athletes, and that we're maximizing how much training we can do for more of those sport-specific training realms, especially for sports like baseball, golf, cricket. We have to practice those specific sports as much as possible. That's going to get us the best at our sport that we can be. But if the athlete is overdoing it, they're not going to see very good results, and they're probably going to get hurt. If they're doing too much in the weight room, they're probably not going to get as much out of that sport-specific power development that they need to get. So first, you have to determine what your goal is. If your goal is learning how to do an exercise, as I've talked about in a previous video, you're going to want to start off with 3 sets of 5 to 10 reps with a very light load that you know the athlete can handle, and they're going to go through the movement slow and controlled. And then your goal is to add resistance after about 2 to 3 weeks or so. You want to gain as much motor control within that movement as possible over that time span. The next goal, if you have to improve overall health of a joint or prevent injury in a joint, you're going to want to have a lot of those eccentric overload and isometric exercises, as I've talked about many times before. Probably 2 to 4 sets of 5 reps with those eccentric overload exercises is all you would need. Those are very taxing movements, and if an athlete is doing far too much volume with those, they're probably going to see a lot of delayed onset muscle soreness, and we don't want any of that because that's going to impact the rest of the training week. So 2 to 4 sets of 5 reps with eccentric overload exercises is a good place to start. With those isometric exercises, you're going to want to go about 20 seconds per set, probably no more than 20 seconds total per exercise per set to start out. You can progress a little bit with the volume there over time, but most importantly here is to stay pain-free in your sport. That's the goal. So get as much training volume as you need to in that area to make sure that the athlete's arm is feeling good when they throw, their knees and ankles feel good when they sprint, their wrists feel good when they swing. Make sure that you're preventing injury in all of those high injury risk spots in the kinetic sequence. Moving on from that, if your goal is maximal force production, you're probably going to want to have somewhere between 10 and 20 reps at very high effort, or 20 to 35 reps at about 80 to 90% effort total throughout the program. So for example, if you have 5 sets of 5, you're probably going to be working at about 80 to 85% of the 1 rep max. If you're going for more force production, you're probably going to be doing maybe something like 8 sets of 2. Over the course of the workout, you'll accumulate about 15 to 16 reps there at very high effort. That's what you want to have. The overall goal there is to increase the load every 2 to 3 weeks. You should be increasing in some capacity if your goal is to increase maximal force production. Moving on from that, if your goal is to improve high velocity strength, again, you probably don't want much more than 20 to 30 total reps in a workout with a medicine ball throw or a plyometric push-up or some sort of a jumping exercise. Or if you're doing a lot of bouncing plyometrics, you probably don't need much more than 50 foot contacts in a session. The goal there is just to make sure your performance is high. Monitor performance. Is that velocity high in those medicine ball readings? Are they jumping farther or higher or faster off the ground than they have before? Obviously, every 2 to 3 weeks, we should see some sort of improvement in medicine ball throws velocity for baseball players. That's something that I like to track a lot of. And we know that if velocity is not improving in those medicine ball throws, then something in their training is not working very well, or something in their recovery is not working very well. So obviously the goal there is to improve their performance. With those sport-specific training measures, I don't like to do a lot more than 20 minutes total in a sports-specific training realm. So if they're hitting or throwing, I don't want that session to be extremely long, because what happens when central fatigue begins to set in very long training sessions, no longer do you start to get any power adaptations in that sport-specific measure, and no longer do you start to get those coordination improvements in those power-specific measures. So if you're outside sprinting and hitting and throwing all day long every day, you're probably not going to get much out of those types of training sessions. So make sure you get the lowest possible effective dosage, and that your training has a lot more quality reps in it than high quantity. Moving on from that is endurance. If you determine that your sport needs a lot of endurance training, I would recommend that those endurance segments reflect the needs of the sport. So in something like baseball, we probably don't need to be doing very long endurance training sessions. If your sport is more in the middle, like baseball or basketball or football, then you're probably going to want to do maybe something like 20 minutes total of conditioning. You don't want to do too much here, especially if you realize that conditioning is not the end-all factor for your sport. You want to be just good enough at conditioning so it's not going to hurt your athletes. So don't spend too much time in this realm, because that can take away from other effective means of training that the athlete needs to. So for example, if you have a really skinny, scrawny athlete that needs to increase force production, you don't want to spend too much time with endurance with them, because that's going to take away from the effectiveness of their strength training, because they're going to be in a fatigued state when strength training. Moving on, lastly, if the goal is hypertrophy and you determine that the athlete needs to put on 10 to 15 pounds of muscle mass, typically speaking, all you'll have to do is compare them to other athletes in your training realm, and you realize that they're very force deficient, they're very scrawny and weak, they're often injured because of this lack of muscularity. If you do determine that, then you're going to want to make sure that you're going through a training session with 10 to 15 hypertrophy stimulating reps with the strength training exercises that you're doing. A hypertrophy stimulating rep is one that has very high motor unit recruitment, or very high levels of effort, and very high levels of peripheral fatigue. So what that's going to look like is, let's say we're doing a heavy set of 8 on the bench press. The first 3 or 4 reps will be like this, pretty fast, and then it starts to slow down, and maybe those last 2 or 3 reps will start to slow down and look something like this, where it's really grinding out to get those last couple reps. Those are hypertrophy stimulating reps, because they have maximal motor unit recruitment and fatigue going on within those motor units with those type 2 muscle fibers. So make sure it's going to suit your sporting needs, though. If you determine that athletes in your sport are much bigger than the athlete that you're training, go with more hypertrophy work. But if you determine that that athlete is big enough, but they need to get stronger or faster, focus more on those training methods and don't worry so much about hypertrophy.